Welcome to the Fine Print. This is David Grau Jr. welcoming you to a new episode format that we hope you enjoy. Historically, the Fine Print podcast has been hosted by me or one of the other experts here at Succession Resource Group, where we discuss and unpack specific topics, sometimes solo, other times with a guest who's either an expert on the topic or a fellow business owner who brings a unique perspective. This episode format we're launching is slightly different, which we've dubbed The Exchange. We have a lot of internal dialogue on various topics, as we've got a lot of smart people here with different skills and perspectives and areas of expertise. But that internal dialogue never gets shared, given it's, internal. So the exchange is our chance to give you as the audience a chance to ride shotgun with those conversations, to sit in as the most experienced team around M&A and succession for advisors goes deep on a topic. We're keeping this new format a bit more casual and conversational, which should help you find these sometimes dense subjects a bit more approachable, if not more actionable. With that, let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of SRG's The Fine Print. Today's topic, we are focusing around selling a practice and the process related to that. Should you find your own buyer using listing services, listing platforms, right? There's lots of ways at this point in this industry to get out of your business. Some work well, some, I won't say work poorly, but maybe suboptimally. We've got a group of experts here. Obviously, we've got Kristen, who leads our seller advocacy team. So she's got a few opinions to share on this topic, as you might guess. But juxtaposing that, we've got Parker, who works both on the succession side, but also on the, I'll just generically label it kind of the self-negotiated deals, right? Through our deal support service, where you've got a buyer and seller who they've already met together, and then Parker's there with his team to try to help facilitate those deals. So it's an interesting comparison and contrast with what Kristen does. And then Ryan deals with all of the above in the valuation topics. So, Kristen, I know you teed up some questions for us just to get the conversation going today.
Yeah. Basically, I think if you're an advisor even thinking about selling, you're going to be hit from every direction. So you are likely getting emails, letters claiming 10 times valuation. You've got aggregators calling with easy roll-up opportunities. You've got practice management and succession teams offering internal solutions. You have your broker-dealer probably pushing at you in one direction or another. And then there's the DIY route, right? Finding your own buyer and trying to navigate the process yourself. And on top of all of that, there's podcasts, firms, thought leaders like us, all sharing different perspectives on what the right path is. So I think that the real question starts to become, how do you actually make the right decision for you? And that could be very different from one seller to the next. So today we, as David mentioned, have brought together a group of experts from valuation and strategic planning, transaction advisory services to unpack what really goes on and how to do it, quote unquote, the right way. So from your seat, whether it's valuation or transaction execution, what do you guys see the biggest risk an advisor might take when trying to navigate a sale on their own?
Not from a valuation perspective, but just from what I've seen over the years and working with advisors, the biggest risk that I see is advisors going out and trying to negotiate deals on their own. And primarily what ends up happening in that scenario is they start networking with friends, people that they know that are in their immediate circle. They narrow it down to maybe one or two people. And what ends up happening in that scenario is they end up taking shortcuts and informalities throughout the entire process. And I can tell you, I've got so many case studies of unique deal scenarios that have come across my desk, or where people have either just put together a one-page sale agreement. But basically what ends up happening is when the seller goes out and networks on their own, there's no NDA, non-disclosure agreement in place. They're sharing confidential information. Due diligence is usually not handled appropriately, either through the buyer or the seller. Sometimes there's more of a focus on the deal than on fit, which, on the outset may make you feel good. However, when you have to step back in and take over the business, hire attorneys, it becomes a mess. And those one-page asset purchase agreements work great between you and the buyer if you're just splitting revenue. But the minute you get a bank involved, bank's not going to underwrite to that. So what ends up happening is they get right up to the finish line when they're ready to start, switching the accounts over, and now they can't get funding. They have to go get the contracts, and attorneys and SRG and people aren't just standing around waiting to go draft asset purchase agreements for you. So you end up having to extend their deal, prolong things. So there's all sorts of things that people run into and risks that they introduce themselves by trying to take shortcuts and do it themselves rather than relying on a professional. And even in the world of valuations, when I'm describing multiples and adjustment for multiples, I use the house analogy and how you value a house. In this particular scenario, you can use a similar analogy in that it's like buying a house. You can sell a house on your own, sure. Is it easier if you use a realtor that helps you go out and market it and bring interest and helps coach you through the process so your house doesn't look lived in, it looks show ready to attract more interest? And it's really the same process when you work with a professional firm to help you get ready to sell and transition your practice.
I also loved what you said, Ryan, about, hey, you're going to negotiate price and terms and they focus on that. What I think is so ironic is that the sellers do think that they're focusing on that. But then, when I work on the sell side, I'm also working with buyers. And what I hear time and time again is, gosh, it's really annoying working with you because if I just could go direct to the seller, I could get this deal done and I wouldn't have to pay as much or I wouldn't have to be so aggressive. And it's like, well, yeah, that's precisely why we're doing this job is so that the sellers can get that better transaction deal. And that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? That could be a focus on purchase price or multiple. That could be a focus on how much they get down or the success rate on that back end payment or future bonus upside payments or employment structure or for them or for their team. Or even just keeping client billings the same or the financial planning, in a similar consistent manner, or so many other components of the deal structure that don't necessarily show up in what you see in headlines, right? Which is multiples. And so I just love when buyers somewhat hate me in that regard because it's like, yeah, then we're doing exactly what we're meant to be doing. And that's getting the transaction, the goal, the end product that the seller is hoping for after a life's worth of work. Parker, I know you're on the non-advocated side. What are you seeing?
Yeah, of course, Kristen. Thank you. Right, non-advocated, aka peer-to-peer. Buyer and seller have found each other. They believe they are the right fit for each other, and therefore they're seeking our help just to ensure that they've properly structured and evaluated the transaction. We see a number of different things here. I think that we're going to be able to go into more depth about different nuances and watch outs that we've seen. But, for instance, here's one factor that ties right into just the nature of those types of sales alone, which is, I would say, not to over rely on the relationship aspect. Obviously, the relationship is wonderful and it's a great thing in terms of potentially being a great fit for buyer and seller. But we've absolutely seen transactions where buyer and seller were the right fit for each other at the start. But by the time we got to the end, turned out they were not such a good fit after all. There was a little bit more beneath the surface between the parties that ultimately they were not aligned. The transaction did not go through, and the seller ended up selling elsewhere. So that's just to say that you can't guarantee that one of your peers or colleagues ultimately is the right choice. Naturally, you may have a good indication and it may bear out and be proven correct, but it doesn't always work that way. The other factor I'd mention as well, just at a very high general level, we'll get into some more nuances and such, but is not to over rely on the relationship and to seriously consider the transaction at hand. For instance, we had a fee only RAA. So I know that term has many different connotations, but in this case, we mean, a flat fee paid by client for support, not anything tied to AUM, anything like that. And the buyer was ready to walk into a situation where they didn't have an adjustment clause. All of the clients were on single year, non-renewable contracts. So they had to be manually renewed each year. And the seller was planning to provide only 4 to 6 weeks of communication while these clients' contracts were still live in order to start shifting them to a new RIA. So in that process, we determined, of course, hey, there needs to be more concerted effort on transition support. There needs to be some downside adjustment. Otherwise, buyer is really setting themselves up for some undue risk. We ultimately got the deal to the right spot and everything was amicable, but it was that reliance on the relationship that sort of dulled everyone's senses to making sure that we were going through, the technical aspects in more detail.
Well, to be honest, I think about the fit component and I think about the deals, Parker, like you and I in the past have worked on these deals together. And so you have a lot of times where you get two peers who they know each other. When it's time to exit, of course, I'm going to sell to you, right? I have pretty high level of trust. The problem is, that's not to say that that person's actually the best fit necessarily, right? That's kind of like, hiring, you know, my friend's son or daughter as a receptionist because I know them. High level of trust, right? But until I interview the other 65 candidates, I can't definitively tell my clients, right? If I'm a fiduciary, I can't really tell them that this is the person who's the best fit because if I follow that up with they're the best fit of the one of one that I talked to, they were the best, right? Like, so you have to kick the tires on the other 64, 65 people that are out there. And if you end up back in the same spot where you say, you know what? And it happens on occasion, right? You confirm the person I started with actually really is the best candidate. But you do have to put a little bit of time and effort in, right? You spent 30 years building this thing, or 20 years, or whoever it was, how long, could be longer than that. You want to put a couple of months into this process to really evaluate who the best fit is. And ideally, again, back to you, Kristen, on the advocacy side, fit's number one on most people's priority lists, or at least it has been for the last couple of years. But guess what's number 2, 3, and 4 on that list, right? It's not fit, fit, fit. It's fit, price, terms, taxes. Like the rest of it matters. So if I nail it down and I've got a great fit, but nobody else to negotiate with, then I've checked that box, but I'm probably going to sacrifice price, terms, and taxes. And it's not that you can't get all of the above. You just can't get all of the above by just selling to the one person who you happen to know and have a trusted relationship with. So again, even if you sell to that same person, make that person feel good about the price that they're going to pay and the check that they're going to write by getting some other competing offers. Again, I'll go back to your analogy right on the real estate stuff. If I go and I buy a house and I have to come in 10% above ask, if I'm the only person making an offer, I'm not going to feel good about that. But if I know there's 6 other offers coming in, I went above ask and I got it, I still feel crazy going above ask, right? But I don't feel as crazy because I know that there were other folks making similar offers, which just simply helps validate the price that I'm paying. So I think even if you are focused on fit, and I don't know that's a universal truth as much anymore, but we can revisit that one later. I think you owe it to yourself, your clients, your family, I don't know, your favorite charities, your church. If you're going to leave hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table, I guarantee there's a whole bunch of people in your life that would love to try to make sure they can figure out what you could do with that money versus just leaving it with the buyer.
So, Dave, real quick, what did you mean by not a universal fit? We're referring to the relationship?
Yeah, I mean, we've always seen that over the last couple of years, right? We're like, oh, fit is my top priority. I will sell at a discount to get the right fit for my clients. I haven't heard that articulated quite as much to the point where, and Ryan, I think you deal with this on the valuations on the very front end, the focus is the price. I wouldn't even say it's term, right? Before it used to be fit, price, terms, and then taxes in that order. And for most people, I feel like now, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way to anybody listening, because you spent decades building this thing. Price should definitely be top of that list. You deserve it. But historically, the industry has oftentimes passed on the highest bidder, the highest 2 bidders to get the person who was the right fit or the team that was the right fit for their clients. And now I feel like most of the conversations I'm hearing are price first, terms second, and then fit's probably on that list somewhere. I'm going to land it at third, but taxes might even usurp that one. Ryan, your thoughts? Again, you're sitting on the front end of this, helping people figure out the value of the offer they've gotten in the mail, unsolicited or in their inbox, compared to the value that you're putting out there. And are you hearing fit coming up as their top priority?
Yeah, my response probably is going to be a bit biased just because in the world of what I do, constantly have to put on battle gear every time I get on a phone call with clients because if they're a buyer, they think the number's too high, sellers think the number's too low. So I mean, what I tend to get a lot of feedback and pushback on is comparing the valuation result to headline multiples that they read that are published in investment news or somewhere else. So those tend to be the conversations of why doesn't the number that you gave me align with my expectations? And so what I end up having to spend a lot of my time doing is working with clients to help them ground and understand what their expectations are attached to, what the reality of those expectations are versus where we are here with your practice and what you have built. When you start reading into the fine print, the practices that are pulling those big EBITDA multiples, those big EBITDA multiples are not practices that are pushing 40 to 50% profit margins. Those aren't practices that are, stripped down and transitioned where it's just the client relationships. Those are turnkey practices. I mean, we're talking multi-billion in AUM practices, multi-generational ownership firms where they've put in the time, the effort, the work. They've brought in the right caliber people. And typically when you see those higher EBITDA multiples, it's because they have very low earnings, but they have a lot of growth potential. They also have demonstrated the ability to grow the practice. And that's the big thing is a lot of people miss is valuation is going to be based on evidence and observable facts. So if it matters, it's going to show up in the numbers. So that's where my perspective is. And then on the other side of valuations, where there's the consulting bit of helping people understand the number and the KPIs and how they can improve their value. But when it comes to fit, where I'm also uniquely positioned in doing valuation work is I get the fallout from these deals when they need somebody to step in as an expert witness because their deal ended up falling apart. And time again, when the deals fall apart, it's because they put terms ahead of fit. They didn't put the appropriate contracts, protections, representations, and warranties of what is the buyer supposed to do versus what are the responsibilities of the seller. And those aren't vetted. They're not done appropriately, especially within this industry, to create clear expectations. And you end up getting cherry picking or, fee changes, things that cause a reduction in revenue that may have been, in most cases, they were buyer inflicted. And well, now the client isn't there, the revenue isn't there, the value isn't there. So either they stop paying, they're not paying, or they just end up saying, you know what, if they're somewhere, they've just handed the practice back and said, here you go. And within the contract provisions, they were allowed to do that. So I would say I'm also an advocate for fit has to be a top priority. It doesn't need to be the only priority, but you're dealing with personalities, you're dealing with relationships, the people that you're working with. You're not the first advisor that they've interviewed. They've probably gone and talked to several other advisors and thought, now this isn't the one for me until they met you. So there has to be some level of due diligence in making sure that there's cultural alignment, also, you know, philosophical alignment and investment preference alignment.
And so many of these deals are that I'm seeing are having sellers stay on for, 2, 5, 10 years post sale. And so to your point, if you have traditionally, right, business owners tend to be probably type A people who kind of like doing it their way, don't really want to take feedback or instruction from others. And now you're getting slotted in as an employee, and that cultural that's already going to be quite a disruption, right, to your life, going from the sole decision maker or main decision maker to not a decision maker, not a key decision maker at the very least, right? You're on the tail end of your career. And then you have a complete cultural disalignment. That's going to end up in a disaster. And more often than not, it does, let alone, you might lose clients or likely will lose clients if there's not cultural alignment. And if you have a team, also probably not looking good, right? They're not going to want to go from this person who has built a particular culture and does things a specific way to a complete shift. It usually isn't going to end well. So I think you're spot on. I don't think that fit needs to be top priority anymore. And I definitely am not seeing that be the case right now, but it definitely needs to be on the list.
I wanted to add a couple items in here as well, just to some of the topics Ryan and Kristen went through. So, for instance, valuation, first and foremost, it's critical to know when that valuation is as of. A lot of times I speak to people, they say, oh, yeah, I have a valuation from a couple months ago, but it turns out the as of valuation date was 10 months prior, right? So, that's a big disparity, which is not always understood. And I know we've talked about commercial capital already. When there's external financing involved, there is a timeline on the valuation, usually up to a year, but some lenders it's relegated to a 6-month time frame. So you want to be very clear on timing there as to when that valuation is applicable, as well as whether or not we might be seeking to right size or estimate a current value based on that formal value, based on some amount of time having transpired. I know that Ryan also mentioned certain post-sale adjustment clauses, performance and degradation, things of that nature. Again, it just goes back to the point of making sure that you're thorough and working with folks that have expertise in this area to ensure that these post-sale stipulations are embedded within the agreement so that, a buyer doesn't have the ability to change affiliation during an adjustment clause, doesn't have the ability to change fees in a certain way, doesn't have the ability to resell clientele or assign or transfer these clients. So there's a lot of restrictions that can be put into place. Has a requirement to maintain a business presence locally, right? Technically, that is not a requirement unless it's made a requirement. Clients are not going to be happy if they suddenly don't have an office to go to, right? And that's not usually the case, but that technically can happen and has happened. Also, to Kristen's point around, sell and be retained type of structures, absolutely, it can be very valuable, but you do have to really be clear about what it is that we're seeking to accomplish, buyer and seller. For instance, we have a deal I'm working on right now, actually, that the buyers are thinking, great, well, the seller's going to continue to manage the tail end of referrals and their network that may be coming into them over the next couple years. They're going to funnel these leads to us. We're going to service them. We're going to pay a referral fee on it, no problem. Come to find out during the discussions, no, actually the seller wants to maintain their own siloed separate book. They're going to roll up all their expenses and infrastructure under the buyer, but they're going to maintain ownership of these new leads and then seek to resell them, which is very different, right? And so that affects what it is that the buyers are willing to participate in on the front end with the transaction itself. And then the other thing I'd note as well is if you are going to have a more traditional sell and be retained structure, well, you also need to understand, right? If you say, hey, I'm going to make 400,000 a year for servicing of clients. Well, if that's outside of the market range, buyer says that's wonderful. I could get someone to do that for 150,000. But if that's something you're set on, right? That differential is something we need to factor into the pricing. Or you can get more creative with structuring as well to seek to mitigate taxes. But these are considerations to be made.
Well, and I would add, so great offers don't just show up, right? Like I know I've talked to some folks where they get unsolicited. I mean, it's not like just a random offer comes through, right? But you get somebody who reaches out, they've expressed interest, and you say, all right, I'd entertain a conversation and getting an offer, and it looks pretty good. Again, I will tell you, even if you're a good negotiator, and most of us aren't good negotiators, right? Even when we think we are, like, you need to be a subject matter expert in what it is you are negotiating before, even if you're a good negotiator, if I don't necessarily know the subject matter that I'm negotiating in, I can be willing to push, but I don't know what the levers are necessarily. So I would say universally, good good offers will show up unexpectedly. Great offers, which is what you likely want and deserve, those do not. As in, like, I've never seen one show up in the first draft that was a great offer. I've seen a few. We had one recently, Christy, where we're looking at. It was from a pretty big firm, couple billion in AUM, buying a smaller shop, and we went through. We see a lot of PE offers and deals, aggregators that are PE backed. And as we read through this thing, I was like, "Ooh, this might be one of the great offers." Like, I say it never happens. This might be it. And then we got to like page 4 or 5. I'm like, "Oh, nope, there's the gotcha." And sure enough, I mean, it wasn't even in, the fine print, pun intended with the podcast. Um, it was just there, but the way it was worded, if you didn't know how to work on these deals, and like it had, your typical, if we don't hit a 95% transition rate of the clients signing new contracts prior to closing, then the buyer doesn't have to close the deal. So you end up, it's a balloon, right? It always gets squeezed and it comes out one end or the other. In your job, to bring it back full circle to the subject matter today, like, if you don't have somebody helping make sure the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and sort of deciphering what this stuff really means after closing, you could just find yourself in a position where you thought you had a great deal. It turns out it was a good deal. And that's just not a great position to be in, especially knowing, I mean, you both pointed that out, Kristen Parker, on how long the sellers are oftentimes involved now. Talk about an awkward situation, right? Where you thought you got a smoking good deal. Turns out within like a couple of months post closing, you realize this deal was not all it was cracked up to be. And that's optimistically assuming that it actually then closed. Again, in a lot of these cases, when you get the good deal, there's fun strings and contingencies attached where you could find yourself having spent weeks with your clients telling them how excited you are about this new partner you're working with, getting new contracts signed, only to get to a 90% transition rate. And then the way that the offer was written, the buyer doesn't have to close. And you get to go have 125 super awkward conversations. So anyway, I'll leave it there. But my universal statement, and I've done this now, more than some, less than others, but a little more than 2 decades to date, I have seen people get great offers. You don't get them in the first draft. It takes work.
Yeah. I don't want to say that buyers are deceptive. They're not, but they're very creative in terms of how they are writing their offer, because they know that you are probably being solicited multiple offers, right? And to get in front of you and to get that initial conversation, it needs to be somewhat eye-popping. And there are offers like the one that Dave mentioned, but several others where it's like, okay, this looks pretty good. And then, like, so what am I missing, right? And you need to read it like 3, 4, 5, 10 times. But sometimes there's just specific deals that are left out of those offers as well that could drastically change the outcome. And so it's not even just being able to read what's on paper, it's being able to ask those additional questions. But there's definitely been instances in my life for one thing or another, right, where you just don't even know the questions that you need to ask, right? And so if you, that's what experts are there for, is to be able to figure out not only what you need to ask, but when you need to ask it and how you need to ask it to get the right answer. Because sometimes, you can ask a question, but if you ask it just the wrong way, well, shoot, you might have just asked a completely different question. And so I think that that's honestly the main thing that we're trying to discuss here, is like, that's why you need someone on your side to help you. But I want to flip the script a little bit. Is there ever a reason as to why it wouldn't make sense to hire a sell side representative?
I mean, I can definitely see a situation where if I was an advisor, or I mean, just as a fellow business owner, if I got something in my inbox from a private equity firm, right? I mean, how flattering that you built a business big enough now to have an outside investor want to come give you money, piles of money, to buy or invest in your business, where you could look at the numbers that they're talking about and think like, that's pretty solid, right? Like, I haven't heard anybody else talking about those numbers. And bird in the hand, two in the bush, where I'm like, I don't want to screw around and end up missing out on this deal. So I'm just going to pursue it. And I go hire an attorney and my CPA to validate the taxes and to write the contracts. And I get the deal done. And I high five everybody around me because that was so easy. I didn't have to pay an intermediary. I got it done quick. And again, if getting the deal done, quick, or if there's only, one offer for a business like yours, that's pretty uncommon, I would get it. I'm sitting here at Succession Resource Group. We're pretty niche, right? But as an advisory business, you know that there's demand for your practice. And if you didn't know, then I am happy to be the first person to tell you here on this podcast. There's a lot of demand for your practice from your peers, your internal team, if you've taken the time and built that, and from outside firms that want to invest in your success. Sometimes PE, sometimes aggregators. We're even seeing it now with the broker-dealers wanting to make those buy-ins. So I can see a scenario where somebody, not that they wouldn't want to hire an intermediary, but they may just not want to rock the boat, right? Like, I think I've got a smoking good deal and I don't want to lose it. So that's probably the only scenario where I could see, aside from just the advisor who doesn't want to pay the fee for an intermediary. But being that intermediary, I can tell you the landmines we will help you not step on and the things that we will help you optimize. Our service is basically free for the additional amount of money and deleveraging of risk that we're going to get you. I know I'm obviously a little biased here, but I would tell you, even if you hired one of our peers instead of us, they will add enough value to your transaction. They will literally pay for themselves, sometimes 2 and 3 times over.
Yeah, and I want to make a quick add-on there as well, which is going back to the self-negotiated variant. Obviously, there's certain buyers out there that purchase more than one business, and so that's wonderful, right? And they amass some experience and some understanding, but at the end of the day, there's only so many transactions that any party will be involved within, whether that's 2 or 3 or 5 or 10, some obviously more than that, but that's a sample size, which is wonderful. But firms like us, we are producing hundreds of transactions per year. So we're having extensive depth and repetition, and really, exploring nuances and different combinations of criteria that go into these deals day in, day out. So that's one of the benefits as well with working someone that's all we do day in, day out.
Right. Yeah, you can try to dot all your I's and cross all your T's, but it's kind of funny. I've heard us say it on previous podcasts. I don't know if we've said it here, but the old cliche, the devil's in the details. The problem with these deals nowadays is it's all details, right? Like, initially it just used to be like, hey, you get an offer in, it's the price, it's the terms, and there'll be capital gains, right? Like, all right, we don't have to worry about the details yet. Most of the offers are 7, 8 pages now, and I'm being conservative, assuming they don't include any kind of pro forma in there. Like, it's all details. It's all I's and T's to get dotted and crossed. So, yeah, again, I go back to your question, Kristen, on where wouldn't you need or wouldn't you benefit from an intermediary? I mean, I guess maybe like internal succession, right? Like, I don't need anybody to help broker that transaction, but frankly, I still need the intermediary, as in, like, I need Parker's team to help identify all the I's and the T's that need to get dotted and crossed, and which ones should be done and in which order. In fact, which ones shouldn't even be in here, right? It's not uncommon that you're dotting the wrong I's and crossing the wrong T's because seller didn't know, buyer didn't know, attorneys didn't know, internal team obviously doesn't know. So it's also part of like, what kind of intermediary? Like, I couldn't imagine going to just an attorney and a CPA and trying to do this myself. Like, selling a business I've spent this many years building. And I don't know if it's, that they don't think that they need an intermediary that does this stuff day in and day out, or they just don't want to pay for it. I mean, as a business owner, we get tired of paying all these bills. But again, I just go back to looking at the end result of the deals that the seller and buyer have negotiated on their own, compared to the deals where there's some outside third party. I mean, it's just such a night and day difference that it's the same reason buyers try to buy off market real estate, that they're trying to buy your practice without any competition. They're going to get a better deal.
Yeah. I mean, even folks who, have passed away and come to us for sell side representation, or folks who are exiting the industry because they have to for some sort of legal reason, right? Regulatory issue, compliance issue. Even those deals need, you'd think like, well, they have no choice. They have no options. And that, even in those cases, could be further than the truth. We've done multiple deals with those circumstances. And even then, we get near ask on multiples, or, above average on multiples or terms. Half of the, if not more than half of deceased advisor sell side represented deals, I'm getting, you know, great multiples, above average multiples, and 100% cash down. Like, if they didn't have someone in their corner, there's no way they would get that. It's very difficult to think of a scenario where you wouldn't benefit, to your point, from a sell side or some sort of intermediary. And even attorneys or CPAs, they really can't fill that slot. Yes, they can help you with contracts, but they're just going to help you do the deal that you've come up with, right? They're not industry specific. They're not going to have nearly the expertise that Parker has on our team to help you get that transaction done in the right way, work through other nuances, not only from an industry perspective, but also just from a nuance perspective. IA agreements, as an example, right? An attorney isn't going to probably know that or care. A CPA, they can help you on the tax side of things, but they're not going to help you negotiate the deal. They're there in an isolated perspective. And so it's really important to understand who you're hiring and what skill set they bring to the table. I think another great question is, gosh, I don't want to pay for this service. And there's plenty of other folks like us, right? Some who require that you pay a monthly fee or retainer or some amount up front. And I think, I've heard one seller who we were working with who didn't choose us say like, oh, well, I liked that methodology because I felt like they were working for me. Interesting spin, right? In my opinion, because working for you towards what goal? They don't, they're getting money from you regardless of whether they're successful or not. But that was that particular seller's point of view. And, other people are like, oh, I don't like the idea of a success fee. It seems really transactional, or I don't like this auction type methodology. Do you guys have anything to say to that? What does auction truly mean? Why might one billing structure be better than another, or is it? What are your guys' thoughts there? What are you guys hearing?
And it's not so much I guess from my perspective, I wouldn't call it an auction. I mean, putting something up for sale is putting it out there in the market for people to take a look at it and express their interest. So, and like, I like the house analogy because it works really well in what I do. So like the house that we just recently bought, uh, when we came and previewed the house, we knew that there was very limited appointments to get in to see the house because of how much interest was expressed in the house. So when we came and viewed it, we liked it. What was the very first thing that we did when we wrote an offer? We knew that there was a lot of interest, that they were booked out for 2 weeks. We happened to get in and we were the first people to get in. So we threw everything that we could at that offer. We ended up putting in, above market offer, and we still got it for a fair, really good price. And that was motivation for us because it checked all of our boxes. It was going to work really well for us. And I was willing to pay more because for me, this is a place where we would spend a lot more time than the other homes where we've done a 4 or 5 year plan with it, move in, remodel it, move out, make some equity on it. Like this is one where we want to stay longer. So we're willing to pay more because it had more intrinsic value to us. So same when you list your practice for sale, that you get more interest. And then on top of the interest, Where you're going to start seeing the real strong offers is people that will see the intrinsic value. Maybe you're in a market that they're wanting to expand into. Maybe you have service offerings that they don't really have, or that they're not as strong on. Maybe you have a specific clientele that you're focusing on that they really want to get in front of. And knowing that there is a active market out there, not that you have single-handedly chose them, which basically means you're walking into the bear's den, but that they know there are other people out there that are actively interested, that is going to encourage them to put a better offer forward. That's my opinion on it.
Yeah, I want to just add to this as well in the sense that we could take the term auction and modify it slightly, I think, to more accurately reflect, which is it's more like a silent auction. It's not as if we're gathering all buyers onto a virtual call like this to be all together and then the seller is made known, right? This is Mr. Seller or Mrs. Seller and their business located here. So everyone's fully aware. This information is redacted, right? So we're not explicitly detailing who the seller is or what business is for sale, but we're giving enough of the critical information to be able to determine, like Ryan said, whether or not this house is in the right neighborhood or has the right amenities or the right school code, right? If we're going with the real estate examples here. And so I just want to make that clear, right? That the confidentiality is still maintained. And not only that, to take it one step further, it's not the highest price gets the deal. It's the most qualified offers are then in consideration that you get to hand select between and then determine, okay, great. Well, we have a good basis for a potential deal. So now I want to have direct conversations with these folks and assess the fit. And you also get to learn a lot about their firm within their offering, right? So you get to do some tentative assessment as to potential fit, and then you have that person to person interaction. So I do want to clarify that as far as the logistics are concerned.
Well, it's a good way to change the label, right? Because again, I think the listing process oftentimes does get equated, or at least in a buyer's perspective, they like to put labels on things. They're going to call it an auction, but we know what auctions are, right? Like this is not an auction. This is just simply leveraging the competitive market that exists to make sure that you fully evaluate your options. You get a handful of, good offers you can compare objectively. Like if we're calling that an auction, then I guess, sign me up when I decide to sell my business, because every seller wants somewhere, right? Maybe it's deep down inside. Like they want those headline multiples. You don't get those headline multiples going off market to one potential buyer. I will say there's definitely some room between those field goal posts though, right? Like we have our seller advocacy light version where we can just work with your buyer or your, one or two buyers you have. Even there, we can still optimize the outcome, right? Like, could you have gotten better offers? The world will never know because we're not going down that path. But what we can do is say, okay, you got a good offer here. Let's make it great, or at least as great as we can, knowing that this is the person you want to sell to. So there's off market, right? Just DIY. Parker and his team can help you facilitate, get the contracts, the taxes, make sure you're not forgetting or missing anything. And then there is the listing or auction, if you want to label it as such. But there's room even in between those two to make sure you still do a smart deal.
I can't disagree with any of what you guys said. I think, you know, we're not auctioneers, right? I'm not going to be standing up saying, "Okay, raise your paddle. Who has next?" That's just simply not how the process works at all. And I think the main people who call a listing or, selling on the open market, if you will, and are typically folks who want to downgrade the value of that particular process, right? Want to speak about it in a negative way, want to kind of put negative ideas into your head, and that's just not how it works. It's meant to be there as a benefit. It's meant to help move the process forward in a systematic way that makes sense, that helps both parties, right, buyer and seller, make decisions and move forward to hopefully create a really successful transaction.
But it's so funny. I was just at a conference this week, actually. And there's a buyer up on the panel that was up on that panel talking to his peers because he's been so successful at going out and getting off-market deals. He'll go out, he'll find folks, he'll affiliate them, let them plug in, give them, great payout. They can plug into his systems and great resources. Sounds very altruistic. It's not. And then he goes to the next slide and he's showing the price that he got these deals done at. And I'm thinking, wow, like he has immediate equity in every single one of these practices. I know you're not going to flip them like a house, right? But he could have, given the price that he was able to pay, and then combining it with his business and being able to optimize it on the back end. So I guess the takeaway here is buyers, I mean, you talked about it, Parker, like they've done it once or twice. How many times do you sell your business? Once? I mean, maybe twice if you screwed up the first time, but you're probably not doing it more than twice. Occasionally, maybe some of you have done it, in other careers, but you never sell a business enough times to get good at it. Buyers do. They are, especially nowadays, I feel like they're students of the game, right? Like they're reading articles, they're talking to their lenders, they're talking to their relationship managers. They are fully equipped. And Kristen, you mentioned earlier, they're not trying to deceive you, but they're also going to definitely try to sugarcoat it, right? Make sure this sounds as good as it possibly can. So you say yes. And you, unfortunately, having never done this before, inadvertently say yes to something that it's not bad, but it definitely could have been better.
Yeah. I mean, and they have oftentimes, you'll see the large firms, they have investors, they have people who they have to make a return for and at certain margins, right? So if it sounds too good to be true, it doesn't mean that it isn't. It just means that you're probably going to have to work a little bit harder to achieve it. I mean, we came across an offer. We get lots of them that come through our desk. And this particular offer, was an awesome multiple. Awesome. Beyond crazy. And we're like, wow. Then you dive a little bit deeper, down payment was pretty good. Nothing necessarily to write home about, but pretty good. And then you start to get further and further. And this particular firm hadn't grown at 20% CAGR ever, like literally 0 times. And that's what their end payment was on, was a 20% CAGR. Mind you, a benchmark that they would have never, ever achieved, never even close to achieving. And yet that's how the buyers are incentivizing them. It's like, the the price was pretty good. The down payment, like I mentioned, was pretty good, but you're never going to achieve that back end payment. It still might be a good option for you, maybe. But it's things like that where it is somewhat a game, right? It's trying to figure out how can you be strategic enough to move forward and put best on paper. But buyers aren't stupid. They're not going to go underwater on this transaction.
Yeah, Kristen, actually, I wanted to just ask you as well. So on that offer, when we're talking about 20% CAGR, is that just based on pure revenue or is that net asset flow? I guess, what I'm thinking about here is what if the market was to pull back right after you implement a clause like that? Did it account for that or was it just kind of generic at a revenue level?
It was generic at a revenue level, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but I believe it was on new revenue even.
Yeah, which, again, not that they couldn't do it, but they haven't. And what's the likelihood that now plugged into a new system with a new team supporting you, who's also focused on margin expansion, right? They're not going to want to go spend a whole bunch of money doing seminars and radio shows and podcasts, that you're going to be able to ultimately drive that kind of growth. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but if I'm a betting man, I wouldn't take those odds. And that's the only way you get to that full value. So again, these are things, to tie it back, right? These are things that your M&A team, your intermediary can help make sure you fully evaluate. Now, to be fair, those advisors looked at that offer and were like, we're not getting that bonus. They didn't need an intermediary to tell them that one. That was pretty obvious. But there's so many other little things. I mean, and to your point, Parker, talk about a 20% CAGR. you know to ask, like, how are we calculating that CAGR? Is that a 5-year average, 3-year average? Is it revenue? Is it AUM, net flow? Those are questions that, again, not that you as a seller wouldn't know to ask them if that was the only thing you had to deal with. But there's 25 other things that you're negotiating. And so that's where the intermediary, as your at least second set of eyes, who's done this 100 times before, can help. But I will also point out, you got to make sure you've got the right intermediary on your team, right? Because I'll use the example of some of the like third-party asset managers that want to provide value add and have some resources and support around these topics, or your broker-dealer home office, right? They'll help you negotiate this stuff. Some of the other intermediaries that wear sort of the same M&A consultant label that we do, but they actually only work with, 2 or 3 of these large aggregators. They look a lot more like a recruiter than they do an M&A expert, right? Their job is to go find deals and feed the beast over here and then get their recruiting fee on the back end. So they don't have a success fee tied to the sale price. So the intermediaries, it's tricky, right? Where you just assume like, well, everybody kind of does the same thing. I just got to find the right team for me or decide if I want to just do it myself. But it's even more nuanced than that, which, I mean, that's a new one for even us, where we have had to start really trying to understand like who the competition is and what their angle is, especially if you don't know how they're getting paid. You got to be extra careful. And if they're charging you retainers or hourly, like an attorney or CPA, you got to make sure the incentives are aligned as well. And that isn't always the case.
That comes up a lot on my end, just because as we're talking to folks, right, they're like, well, I'm talking to this firm over here, or that firm over there. And, um, you know, again, we want to try and say all the right things, right? We want to try and market ourselves in the best way. And so does everyone else. But I think that what we really try hard to do is be probably overly transparent at a detriment in terms of what we do, how we do it, how we get paid, down to how a buyer may or may not pay us as well as part of an engagement, right? We want you to have the full picture. And I think that particular question is really important to ask any sort of intermediary, because there's a lot of firms out there who are like, oh, I'm going to be your fiduciary, right? We're sell side. We only charge you a monthly fee, right? No success fee might be stated. But you know what they're also doing? They're charging the buyer a fee to help them find deals, which is why you keep seeing the same buyer names circulate through, right? And guess what they're presenting to you? The 2 to 3 top PE firms that they know exactly how the transaction's going to look, right? They're not advocating for you. That's a bunch of BS. They're advocating to get that deal done as quickly as possible within the parameters that they know. And for me, that really irritates me 1,000%, because people just are getting this wool over their eyes, and it's like, no, you need to really check into the details of that, because if you think you're getting sell-side representation, then that means they shouldn't be getting, right, extra dollars from the buyer, or at least you should know how or why they're getting those extra dollars. I can go on and on for days about this, but it's really important to understand as you are finalizing this final stage of your career, selling your baby, what are you getting out of this relationship from an intermediary, and how are they truly representing you? But if you keep seeing the same buyers, that might be a telltale sign of, gosh, maybe we need to look a little bit into this. They're not helping you get the right fit or even the best deal. They're just making it seem like you are.
Yeah, I think a lot of intermediary companies just bank on the fact the sellers don't know that. So, unless they're putting the tombstones up or advertising them, you're not going to see the same sellers on them. Like there are a lot of firms that they don't share that information. So, as a seller, it would be beneficial for you in conducting due diligence. Ask whoever you're working with, how many firms have you transacted with this particular buyer? Because I've seen that before, other firms I've worked at where, they have a list of preferential buyers that they want to work with just because they know that they're going to pay their fee on time. They know they've had good success in selling other businesses, or in some instances when we have a less than ideal practice coming to market that's going to be hard to sell, we know this one will take them. So, that's part of it's okay to have a network, but you also want to make sure that there isn't bias in who you're being presented to that is not necessarily aligned with your prerogatives.
Yeah, I just to add on to that, I think it's very important what Dave said. I think Ryan and Kristen both alluded to it as well, is just to fully understand how these firms are being compensated, right? Seek that full disclosure because they may not be legally required to provide that disclosure, right? So you want to be absolutely clear. Are there any other economic incentives associated with any of the parties involved, right? Because that obviously can heavily skew or bias or influence the outcome.
Well, and who are you being introduced to, right? How many people are you going to be able to compare and contrast against? How many firms are being looked at here? How are those firms being vetted? I think that the idea of bringing new firms to the table that you may not already know about, that is important. It's a good way for you to compare and contrast. I think, yes, we have seller advocacy light, and that's where, as Dave mentioned, we can bring the folks that you want to the table, and we can help negotiate a deal with those particular folks. But it's really ironic when we didn't have that service, we still allowed that through our traditional program. But what was really interesting was those folks, I think, got chosen. I can remember only one deal where the seller provided buyer was the actual chosen buyer in a true, market listing. Let's find a buyer who meets fit, price, terms, taxation, whatever, right, requirement you may have. Only one time in all the deals that I've done has that buyer actually been the true buyer. So I think that the benefit of really expanding that optionality is that you can truly look yourself in the eye, your clients, your team, your family, and say, hey, I've really done my due diligence, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that this is the right firm for you.
Well, and I'll say, just piling on to your comments, Parker and Kristen, when the time comes and you're going to exit, and assuming you're not going to sell it to your internal team, you do want an intermediary that has a broad enough network, right? Like, there's some great investment bankers in our industry, right? But they focus on buyers that they have relationships with that have tens of billions in assets under management. And that's not a bad thing, right? But that is a specific buyer archetype that does a deal a certain way. They price deals a certain way. But then there's the sort of mid-tier aggregator. They're still big, right? Like, they're big enough, they know what they're doing, but they price deals slightly different. Their deal structures are a little bit different. Their expected margin expansion post-sale and the return for their investors are going to be different. And then you got your peer buyers, who, right, are your size, plus or minus, a couple million in revenue. Again, totally different type of buyer, different type of deal, different type of pricing. When the time comes to exit, I would say it's worth kicking the tires on offers from all of those folks, right? To really try to make sure you do get the right fit. But you also don't have to sacrifice the price and the terms in exchange for the fit. And if you do this right, this isn't like a radio bubble here where you got to pick one of the three. You can have them all, but it'll take a little bit of work. So, closing comments here, just a few things I had jotted down, and I'll see what you guys have to help close this out. I mean, in my mind, with the deals I've seen, even the ones, Parker, you're working on, where it's just between a buyer and seller who already know each other, the deals are more complicated today. I mean, when I compare deals that we got paid 10 and 15 years ago to do, I look back on them like, man, I don't know why people paid us to do it back then, because those deals look so simple by comparison. And in the moment, they weren't, right? But if you compare those deals to today's deals, where you've got performance payments in multiple stages of equity being bought and sold, you've got rolled equity in the buyer's firm, right? Who's now PE backed. Like, these deals are exponentially more complicated. And so knowing that some of you listening may still be looking at that and saying, you know what, but I'm not concerned about getting every dollar of value out of this thing. Okay. But before you finish that sentence, bring your spouse on. You're not married? Bring your kids on. Don't have kids, don't have a spouse, because I've legitimately heard that argument before. Again, bring your pastor on. Bring your favorite charity you support on. If you had to pick giving hundreds of thousands of dollars of value away or leaving it on the table, would you give it to your buyer or would you give it to fill in the blank? And so I just think you can take advantage of an efficient market, but it will take a little bit of time, take a little bit of effort. So ideally, give yourself that time, right? If you get an offer in the mail and it seems too good to be true, pick the phone up and kick the tires on it. Make sure you feel well advised because, again, you only get to do this once.
My main closing comment is just to emphasize what you just mentioned, which is giving proper time, care, and attention to the process. Even in the peer-to-peer self-negotiated space, right, where folks have this existing relationship, we can't be over-reliant on that relationship or high-level understandings around what we might be agreed to. These processes take time. The more time you invest into it, the lower stress it's going to be, the higher success rate you're going to have, the less variables or last-minute changes you're going to have to work through. Every once in a while, deals have to push past their closing date, right? That's not the goal, but it does happen. So you want to avoid that outcome. The more time you put into this on the front end, the better outcome you're going to get across the board. And just understanding that your buyer is someone that you are very agreeable with obviously goes a long way, but it's not everything. There are other factors and processes that need to unfold.
Any closing comments from you, Ryan?
One thing I would highly encourage is, selfish plug here, valuation, which is going to be the starting place for most people, and not waiting until it's time to pull the trigger to get the valuation done in the spirit of timing and giving yourself plenty of time. Make sure that you've done a valuation at least 3 years prior to getting ready to sell. That's going to give you the longest runway to make any deliberate changes within the practice to improve the value, to make sure that it is in good order in order to help transition it. People that tend to wait right up until the last minute go through this process and find that, one, they don't have the information that they need in order for the valuation to be performed. And that right there becomes an issue, because when you get ready to sell your practice, there's going to be due diligence. You're going to have to produce the information we're asking for in the valuation anyways. So more so important than just getting the number and understanding the key performance indicators, it's getting your documentation right, understanding how and where to access that information. If there's any issues in your financials or in your reporting, making sure that those are getting flushed out. So it's really more of going through a hygiene check of your practice and your financials and business management to make sure that those documents and that all your reports are cleaned up and actually representative, and that you understand what your KPIs are. So if you want to, then you can enact and you can start putting in the time and effort to continue driving value to get it to where it'll meet your needs when you are ready to sell.
Yeah. Good closing comments. And Ryan, you mentioned the sort of listing it yourself. That is a point I'll close us out on, right? If you decide to pursue offers on your own, negotiating with buyers, it isn't like you're going to pursue that first. And if that doesn't work, then you go hire an intermediary and list. You've cut yourself off at the knees, or at least you cut the intermediary off at the knees by going out and already sort of exposing this thing to the market. So just make sure you spend the time to figure out who's the right fit to help guide you through this process. If you don't find a good fit somehow, you're going to go it solo. It is what it is, but I will leave us with the fact that I think you all know, based on either headline multiples, press releases that we put out at least once a year on current trends and multiples around M&A for the industry, your business is by far your most valuable asset. And if it isn't today, it will be by the time you sell. And the one thing that we've at least all got in common is we're all leaving the industry, right? Horizontally, vertically, you and I both know it's coming. And so knowing that, sort of dying at your desk, which, we've heard in years past, isn't your likely actual exit strategy, Just give this the time and attention that it deserves for you, your family, your clients, all the key stakeholders in your business. So with that, we hope we left you with a little bit more information than you showed up with, but that's a wrap. Thanks. And that concludes another episode of The Fine Print from SRG. We hope you found this episode both interesting and valuable. We encourage you to check out our website at www.successionresource.com. And of course, connect with us on social media for the latest happenings here at SRG. If you just can't get enough of The Fine Print, we invite you to join our monthly webinar series and newsletters where we address many of the topics covered in this podcast in greater detail. Finally, if you enjoyed today's episode as much as we did recording it, please leave us a review, a good one, mind you, and tell your industry friends about us. Your support helps us continue to bring you the best content possible. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests or individual hosts and not necessarily the views or opinions of Succession Resource Group. Content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, as amazing it might be. Always seek the advice of an expert with any questions you may have. As always, we at SRG stand ready to help when you're ready.